morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 ICIT Spring Briefing, ICT Supply Chain Resiliency, the Way Ahead. My name is Param Eftekhari, the founder and board chair, and on behalf of ICIT and our co-chair, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, I want to thank all of you for joining us this morning. Very briefly, for those of you who may not be familiar with ICIT, we are a nonprofit cybersecurity think tank based in Washington, and our mission is quite simple. We're here to improve the resiliency of our nation's 16 critical infrastructure sectors, defend our democratic institutions, and empower generations of cybersecurity leaders. And this briefing is among one of the ways in which we go about supporting our mission. I want to first of all thank you and thank our co-chair, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and its executive director, Mark Montgomery, for working so hard to make today's briefing possible. I want to also thank our sponsors, Checkmarks, Finite State, Blue Prism, and the Cybersecurity Collaborative for making today possible. I want to remind all of our attendees about the case study lightning talks and the ICIT consulting corners, which will give you an opportunity to collaborate and engage with the attendees and some leading technology providers who will make opportunities possible for continued dialogue around some of these sessions that you'll be engaging with today. I now want to introduce the chairman of today's event, Mr. Don Davidson, an ICIT fellow and the director of cyber supply chain and risk management at Synopsys. Don was critical in building today's curriculum, agenda, and program, and it's been a privilege to watch him lead today's event. Don, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Param. I'd like to thank the ICIT leadership and the Solarium Commission leadership for providing the opportunity to bring public-private partners together to talk about this global supply chain challenge we all face today. Also like to thank the ICIT technical staff who slaved over this project to include some weekends to bring the program we have today. And most importantly, I'd like to thank the public-private sector volunteers who are contributing their time and subject matter expertise to provide valuable discussion that the audience should consider on the way ahead for securing our global supply chains. The program itself is broken into keynotes and panels. There are 3 keynotes. Joyce Corell providing our opening keynote on supply chain threats. The second keynote is around lunchtime, and that's Robert Morgus providing insight into the Solarium white paper on global supply chains. And the third keynote, our closing keynote, is on public-private partnerships, provided by Admiral Mark Montgomery and Robert Strayer from Solarium and ITI. 3 panels are configured for your consideration today. The first one will be led by me, and that's on level setting supply chain risk management activities, past, present, and future. The second panel will provide a sector perspective on how sectors or ecosystems are managing their risk with the ICT products they consume into their ecosystems. And the third panel is led by John Miller, out of ITI, and he's going to be looking at the tech providers managing risk in their products or services provided to those sectors. And I failed to mention that was John Boyan's leading panel number 2 on the sectors from NIST. My apologies there. Back to you, Paul.
Great. It's an exciting program. We're really just feel privileged to have all those incredible thought leaders who've come together today to educate hundreds of people who've signed up for this program across the nation, and so we're really excited. And I'm privileged to be introducing our opening keynote, Ms. Joyce Corell from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, to deliver our opening remarks on a topic entitled Global Supply Chains and Threats to Critical Infrastructures. If you're not familiar with Ms. Corell, she is the Assistant Director of Supply Chain and Cyber Directorate of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center within ODNI. Prior to this posting, she was the Assistant Director for the Strategic Capabilities Directorate of the Office of the National Counterintelligence Executive. Joyce, as she'll talk about in a moment here, it does a tremendous amount of work in a number of areas, including supply chain resiliency. And so we're really privileged to have you here today. And Joyce, it's good to see you again virtually. And we'll hand it over to you to deliver our opening remarks.
Thank you, Param, and Don, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here to speak at this event. You guys have a phenomenal lineup of presenters. So I would like to start by sort of setting the stage from a supply chain resilience perspective. I think everyone in the US, internationally, we all learned quite a bit about supply chain resilience through the pandemic. I think we recently had sort of the anniversary of the shutdown here in the US as people learned just how fragile some supply chains are, how resilient other ones are, just based on going to the grocery store and finding out where our favorite things were stocked or not stocked. And I think we also learned how easy it was to shop online and have things delivered at home. And the incredible flexibility that people have shown and the creativity to make ends meet is a homage to resilience in and of itself. So here we are today, where supply chain issues are now dinner table conversation, as we've experienced. But more recently, in the software supply chain environment, I think we've experienced a couple of events that are a bit of a wake-up call for some people. And what I'm referring to here is in late November last year, when FireEye and Microsoft made it publicly known that there had been a breach of the SolarWinds products, and that it had been, as the time passed, discovered that there had been an adversary present on the SolarWinds systems for nearly a year. So a very stealthy adversary present, who was then able to move in a very agile fashion. And this has been attributed by many of the commercial threat companies as a Russian state-sponsored initiative. A lot of congressional attention was brought to bear on these issues, as several different committees have begun holding hearings to look into how we can be better postured to prevent or exist and be resilient in the face of these types of activities. More recently was the Hafnian attack that became known in early March of this year and has been attributed to a Chinese state actor by Microsoft, and an actor that was able to use zero-day exploits in a fashion that had not been seen before. So here we are, awake to the understanding that adversaries are determined, they're persistent, they can be stealthy. So we now need to think through how we respond to these issues, and what actions do we take now rather than just continuing to observe the problem. Now, let me take a little bit of a walk back in history and look back a decade and where we were as a country. We were only beginning to talk about supply chain things at that time. Supply chain security was still a very esoteric topic. There was much more attention from a cybersecurity focus placed upon sort of perimeter security and basic cyber hygiene. Back in the early 2000s, 2011, 2012, in the Department of Defense, the Defense Science Board was tasked to look at resilient military systems faced with the advanced persistent threat. So several distinguished graybeards embarked upon a 18-month study. And what they came out of at the end of that study were some recommendations for the Secretary of Defense about how to be postured to be resilient in the face of an advanced persistent threat. And some of these recommendations, I bring these up because some of the recommendations have been surfaced over and over the past decade. So clearly, these are themes. So one theme is that we have scant resources. So government and industry should take a risk-based approach to making decisions as to how to harness and protect those highest priority systems and sources of information. Another recommendation that became a theme was that it is more, having a secure posture and being resilient is much more than just perimeter security. More things need to be thought through. If you harden your perimeter, the adversary will just go around that and seek to either recruit an insider or subvert your supply chain, whether it's a hardware or software supply chain. And third, the need to have an educated workforce force that has the foundational tools and basic skills from a cybersecurity and just a security discipline perspective, was sort of the third theme that has echoed throughout the past decade in many different areas. So shifting from history to where things have evolved, how have we evolved as a nation in looking at supply chain issues as more and more software supply chain attacks have received public scrutiny, and how the government has sought to guard against threat actors. In 2017, I'm going to call this a Pathfinder issue rather than a wake-up call. And by Pathfinder issue, I mean it was something that helped rally people together with a common cause for a common goal. And this was the effort led by the executive branch, looking at a concern posed by the use of Kaspersky Labs branded products on federal systems. And throughout the 2016-2017 timeframe, the government reached a decision that to have this antivirus technology on federal systems was too great a risk. Therefore, agencies needed to remove, if any of these products were on federal systems, they needed to be removed. So in late 2017, in the fall of 2017, the Department of Homeland Security issued a binding operational directive instructing civilian agencies to remove any of these products from their systems. So that was sort of the first step, say a bold step taken by the government to address what was perceived as an unmitigatable risk. So the executive branch took actions, but the executive branch was not alone in attention to issues posed by adversaries using a company as a threat vector. In 2018, Congress passed several pieces of legislation that were remarkable in the breadth of scope and the tools that were provided to government to better manage risk. So one of those was the final review of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. and updating the tools that the government had under the statute. There was the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. And this statute, which was captured in the National Defense Authorization Act that year, expanded the remit of the CFIUS committee led by Treasury to look at a broader set of transactions where foreign investment and foreign screening was necessary to guard and protect things from a national security perspective. Hand in glove with this expansion was of this national security tool was an overt acknowledgement that national security and economic security are both one and the same in many cases. Subsequent to the examination of foreign investment and foreign screening was the companion piece of updating export controls. And that was also done in the same legislation with an eye to emerging technologies and a concern about illicit tech transfer. In a more narrow tactical effort by the Congress at the same time was the passage of, in the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 889, which is a sweeping prohibition on any federal spending on products produced by 5 named Chinese companies. This piece of legislation was actually a wake-up call for many government agencies as they spent the next couple of years, since 2018 to 2020, and are still doing this now, figuring out exactly how to ensure that the tools they use, the things they procure directly, or how federal funding, even grant monies, are used indirectly, are not going to further the use of equipment from these companies in government systems or in the U.S. The final piece of legislation in 2018 was the passage of the Secure Technology Act. Within that statute was the establishment of the Federal Acquisition Supply Chain Security Act, which created the Federal Acquisition Security Council. And this statute now, for the first time, put in place by law a requirement that all government agencies must have supply chain risk management programs. So this was an important measure for many organizations to have this encapsulated in legislation. Many of you are well aware that supply chain risk management requires that multiple different people from many different walks of life must come together to understand risk. It's not just the CIO and the network defenders that need to understand the risk posed by a company being used as a threat vector, but the acquisition community needs to be educated. The procurement folks, your security professionals, who look at personnel security issues or physical security issues. So a wide variety of people need to come together, and when that happens, when you have to bring together multiple disciplines that don't normally come together, there needs to be some top-down driver to make that happen. And for the government, in this perspective, legislation was the way to begin to put that top-down driver in place for agencies. So here we are today, where those issues that I had described previously were supply chain related pieces of policy and governance tied to information communications technology. In parallel to looking at the ICT industry has been a focus on the broader macro supply chain ecosystem, where as a country, we worry about our manufacturing base, our industrial base, and whether we have a healthy economy and a healthy ecosystem. And I'm going to describe what happened during the Trump administration and tie it in to where the executive branch is at now in today's look under the Biden administration on supply chain issues. So back in the about 2017, the Trump administration issued an executive order that was entitled Assessing and Securing the Manufacturing and Defense Industrial Base and Supply Chain Resiliency for the U.S. So this was the first effort of a White House directed action for executive branch agencies to look domestically at how healthy is our industry. And this was an effort where the Department of Defense led the way in pulling together a report which was called for by this executive order. Multiple different agencies came together. We had the security agencies, as well as the economic agencies like the Department of Commerce and the State Department and the Department of Labor. So multiple different organizations came together to write to do this in very initial baselining on the health of our domestic industry. A year later, a report was produced and presented to the president that outlined several areas of risk in our infrastructure, in our economy, in our industrial environment that were considered areas of risk, where then the government would need to figure out how do we prioritize, how does a government industry come together to prioritize managing that. So several of the risks that were identified were not exactly earth-shattering, bright light coming on type of issues. So, for example, there's a concern that in some cases there's only a single supplier, or a government organization is relying on a sole source of something. So you can imagine if there's only one supplier, then there's only so much production and capacity that one supplier can provide. So that scarcity and that fragility is obviously going to be a concern. Other examples were related to the fragility of a company. Maybe there weren't enough, the margins were really thin, the customer base was intermittent, and a company was on financially shaky ground. So either a company's fragile or a market is fragile. Additionally, of these different concerns, another concern was product security and the ability to ensure that products were being produced so that they were secure and that they performed in the way that they needed to perform at the time in which they were needed to perform. So this first baseline effort was the very beginning of how we as a nation are looking at our industrial base. Subsequent to that was the work that the Department of Defense was required to do to produce a report to Congress looking more closely at the Department of Defense industrial base. And this report was actually published in January of this year, and it looked back on 2020 and where the department thought their industry, key industries were from a departmental perspective. In this report, the Department of Defense identified several recommendations to Congress about areas that needed attention. So one of those was a recommendation that some things just needed to be reshored. Now, this study was also being done during 2020, at the height of the pandemic, when we were also recognizing other shortages in sources of supply and other challenges in beyond just logistics of moving things from one place to another. So some things needed to be reshored. And from the Department of Defense perspective, the two primary areas of concern were in semiconductors and in shipbuilding. There was also a recommendation that more attention be paid to building the workforce. And I mentioned, attention to the workforce was a theme from a decade ago. So again, the Department of Defense focuses on the workforce needed for advancing technology in key areas, as well as having an R&D base that was viewed as something that had suffered over time from a lack of investment. Another recommendation, a third of four recommendations, was for the department to continue to focus on acquisition modernization and making sure that the procurement tools that the department has stay abreast of how events evolve and the industrial base evolves as well. And finally, and I think this fourth recommendation reflects a real change in thinking and a reflection of more creativity between government and industry that I have seen in the past decade in the supply chain resilience area. And I think this may be where, as a nation, we learn to become more resilient. And this fourth area of focus was on new ways of leveraging private sector innovation and public sector resources, and in the form of things like trusted capital and more creative ways to lash up financing with stimulating the innovation ecosystem. So now, that's where, that's an examination of where the government has been in this really robust baselining of our industry and identification of risks, shortcomings, and challenges. So many of you probably read the executive order that came out of the Biden administration in February on America's supply chains. And this is being, the president issued this executive order, and shortly after that, the executive branch, the White House convened executive branch agencies, as is the normal process, and has begun to embark upon the 100-day sprint that was called for. The word sprint wasn't used in the executive order, but 100 days to produce a report on risks to key supply chains that were identified. So the semiconductor. So the four primary studies that were identified were semiconductors and advanced packaging, high capacity batteries like for vehicles, advanced batteries, third, critical minerals and strategic materials, supply chain for those. And finally, pharmaceuticals and advanced pharmaceutical ingredients. So those were the four priority areas that the administration wants to look at. And the focus here isn't going to be solely on sort of the macroeconomic, are these industries healthy, but broadly the entirety of, do we have job opportunities? Is there job creation opportunities? Are we innovating effectively? If we only had a few resources, where would we apply those resources for maximum effect? This is being characterized as a signature presidential initiative. And there will be a priority. There will be, after these studies come in and the results from the studies come in, there will be government and private sector dialogue on what are the best ways to ensure that if there are areas that we need to reshore up, then how do we prioritize those? Are there any shortcomings that need immediate attention, or are there issues that can be paced, addressing them can be paced out over several years? So this will be interesting times as we see the economic element of creation, coupled now with, from a cybersecurity perspective, and what we have seen of the adversaries coming into our software supply chains and continuing to pursue access to information through illicit means. So I would make the case here that right now, I think we have what I would say is a call to action. When we've seen what has transpired in the most recent cybersecurity intrusions, and we know, for example, that the Chinese have stolen massive amounts of data, and that with greater skills in artificial intelligence and machine learning, one concern we have is, will the adversary be postured to exploit identity at scale? So from a threat perspective, I think that's one of the things we need to keep in mind when we prioritize what systems we protect. There's been quite a bit of discussion about national critical functions and where capabilities and technologies that have been identified as systemically important enterprise software and services. And if we can make sure those are locked down and produced securely and operated securely, maybe that's where we prioritize first. That might make sense when thinking about critical infrastructure. But from a mission owner perspective, we also need to think about criticality and identify what are the most important mission things, what are the most critical mission activities that need to be protected. So these are two slightly different ways of thinking about what is critical that both need attention. So I think from a framing perspective, we need to think about our security as an activity where we are actually integrating multiple security disciplines. And we think about integrated risk reduction rather than risk elimination. How do we prioritize what risks to focus on first? I think at this time there will be an increasing demand for responsibility and accountability, and an increasing demand for transparency. So when we do business with third-party entities and we're worried about an undue amount of bad influence, we really want to know ultimate beneficial ownership. So do we have that kind of transparency? Is that available? The Department of Defense has already drawn a line in the sand with its efforts to require cybersecurity maturity model certification. This is a step taken because self-attestation of security controls is no longer enough. So, and thirdly, there's increasing demand for disclosure obligations. So someone has suffered a breach, how quickly do they respond to that? And, hand in glove with these calls for disclosure obligations are calls for improved information sharing. And this is a time when we may need to sit down and re-examine when, as a nation, we first looked at improved cybersecurity information sharing, go back and re-examine a safety model that has been beneficial for the aviation industry, for aviation safety. So that's an area that might require greater attention for better incentives or better, more trust and more confidence in more robust information sharing and information sharing, at speed. So finally, I would like to wrap up with an issue that we've been doing from an awareness perspective for the past 4 years to raise awareness on the topic of supply chain security and supply chain resilience. We've reached out from my organization, across the government to our colleagues in other agencies to join us in a messaging campaign throughout the month of April, which is it was initially called National Supply Chain Integrity Month, but this year it's going to be International Supply Chain Integrity Month, as we're embracing our partners across the pond and to the north of us and south and east and west to join us in this messaging campaign. So to wrap up, I really do think, beyond awareness, it's just no longer enough for us to have an awareness campaign. This is really a time for a call to action. So I'd like to thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to have any follow-up questions as this progresses.
Fantastic. Joyce, thank you so much. That was incredible. As I was listening to your comments, I jotted down, there was so much depth to your comments, but some of the words that struck out to me were, prioritization. You talked a lot about the need to prioritize the various elements to tackling everything you talked about. You talked about accountability, transparency, and so many of the comments you made. Obviously, there's a tremendous need to continue just the work over the last decade. So much of it goes back to public-private partnership, just the need for the government and industry, as you just mentioned, not just domestically, but internationally, for us to come together and work more closely together. And I know that you and your team and so many others across the government are doing just that. So thank you for those comments, and thank you for the work you're doing. And again, to all of the attendees out there, I encourage you to reach out to the NCSC, to your state, local, federal partners. That's what they're there for. We're here to solve those problems with you, to work together. So Joyce, thank you for your comments. And to all the attendees, please stick around. We're going to jump right into the next session, which is our first general session panel. So Joyce, thank you. Attendees, thank you.